new insights. That's awesome. Some insight about Russian immigration to Israel from my perspective. I would say in advance, I'm no professor, I'm no doctor, I'm just a kid who grew up in Israel for Russian immigrants. Most of the thing I'm going to say is from personal experience. I will give some facts, but I might be wrong on some of them, so feel free to check me out. Just like letting you all to know in advance. Although I'm gonna like put a presentation and like, show some pictures about my family, about things I got through in my life, feel free at any time to unmute yourself. And if you have any questions, really, it's more for me like in conversation and sharing like my experience. And you can also like in the end also. So nice to meet you everybody. And I'm really happy to be here. Before I'm going to start, I would love to hear from you a bit. So I will not say things repeatedly or I'm going to be boring from the beginning. What do you all know about USSR, about Ukraine, about Russian immigration? I would love like to hear a bit like of your knowledge.
A friend who used to be here in Lancaster, who is originally from Minsk, came here many years ago.
Awesome, thank you.
I remember when I was in high school, is before Jews were allowed out of the USSR, and there were rallies, students struggled for Soviet Jewry, and there was all kinds of, rallies and petitions and work done trying to get the Soviet Jews to be allowed to leave.
Do you remember how they called themselves in that time?
Well, we call the student struggle, you mean the Russians, the refuseniks?
Yeah. Refuseniks, yes.
So I remember two things. I remember hearing or reading, and again, this is just from what that the Russian immigrants to Israel were problematic. That they brought gangs with them potentially, and stuff that gangs will do. Number one. Number two, and that Russia and Ukraine are in the news right now. It's a hot topic right now, but that has nothing to do with Jews. Okay.
Well, I'd like to say my grandparents came from Odessa. I think that's in the Ukraine.
Odessa, yeah, it's in Ukraine.
Yeah, and they came over. My grandfather, I think I call him one of the original draft dodgers because he was fleeing a draft into the White Russian Army before World War I when they came over.
Oh, wow. Do you speak in Russian by any chance?
My grandfather spoke Russian, Italian, Yiddish, and English.
Wow.
And he and my grandmother, my mother's side were from there. And they came over, and when he came over, he was at 14 cutting the soldiers' hair for World War I when they were going back over to Europe from the US. And I think I also wanted to say that we have a link to the Kings Bay Y where you are, because my wife and I met there as counselors over, was it 56 years ago?
Wow.
We were counselors in the YMYWAHA day camp together, which was actually held in the elementary school in Manhattan Beach.
Wow. First of all, it's amazing. Thank you for sharing. I'm actually right now excited. You cannot see, but I have like goosebumps right now, which is like exciting. Thank you so much. So everything is said, it's incredible. And thank you so much. Please remember refuseniks and remember the gangs you've been referring to, because we're gonna get back to that later. I'm gonna share screen, but again, feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. If I'm talking too fast, if I don't know, something you don't understanding properly, like feel free. And if you don't feel comfortable, you can write it down in the chat. Adi, please let me know if there's something in the chat coming up.
Patrik, I just want to check. Arthur, can you hear us? Just want to make sure. Yes, okay. Because he got in and out.
Okay, also there is an improv class out of my office. So if there is any noise that's not coming from me, it's kids like practicing some improv of like theater stuff. Okay, so I'm gonna share screen. You all know me. So let me represent myself again. I'm Patrik. I'm originally from Beer Sheva, Israel. I moved to New York last September in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. My parents both immigrant from Ukraine, and I'm going to talk about them later. I'm working here as a teen director, which is more about like programs for kids, teenagers, focusing on Israel and Jewish culture, mostly what Adi is doing, but more for younger kids. So that's me in general, and you're gonna learn more about my family throughout this presentation, and feel free to ask questions. So USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which is long, and even in Hebrew it sounds a lot, but it's more about the country that become one of the biggest in the history of socialism, of living by the socialist law, founded in 1922 after kind of like a civil war from the Russian Empire in the end of World War I. And Lenin was the one who was leading in the beginning USSR, one of the biggest thing that was part of the socialism country, which started with Lenin and became more kind of like Stalin. And if you don't know, Lenin and Stalin was both the leader of the USSR in the early of the 20th century. Stalin and Lenin both believed that the USSR needs to be with no religious. No Judaism, no Christian, no Muslim, nothing. It needs to be a country that is secular, that everybody is equal by the socialist law, and been involved and kind of like managing that no religions will have a big practice there. And I'm saying it mostly for coming for a Jewish family and Jewish roots, and we're gonna get to the World War II in a second. Jews weren't allowed in any type of religious to practice religious stuff out of their homes. Even if you're in your home and you're practicing religious and somebody's catching you, like catching you in the middle of practicing, it's kind of like not that's it, game over, but there've been a lot of like prisoners because of practicing religious and etc. And that's kind of like transformed the Jewish religious and the Jewish Russians, Ukrainian, from all the 15 states to practice it in kind of like in a hideout. USSR been one of the most biggest in the history countries by landmark. And just to understand it, it was like being part of like 11 time zones. You can live in the USSR and you can have friends 11 time zones far away from you, and you're still in the same country. It's crazy. And in that time, it was 6 of an Earth land service, which is, I found like, I can imagine, I can understand how big is that. So inside the USSR, there have been 15 states that's been part of it. Ukraine, which my family coming from, was from it. So I talked about World War I, and I will not get into more deep about like the wars in general, but as a Russian Jew, as something that I know from my community, and even here in New York, when I'm working inside the Russian community, one of the biggest values and the biggest like memorable parts for us as like as a community is World War II. In Israel, there is once a year kind of like a parade for veterans who've been in the world, who've been like practicing and being part of it, for Holocaust survivors, but mostly for people who've been part of the Red Army or any other army in Israel. It's usually celebrated in the 9th of May, which in Russian we say Den Pobed, which translated to the day of the victory, the day that we won the war in 1945. We as Jews all around the world remembering the 6 million that killed in the Holocaust. Russian communities, and when I'm saying Russians, I have to say in advance, when I'm saying Russian, it's coming from all Soviet Union. So Soviets, when they're celebrating Den Pobed, the 9th of May, they're remembering 26 million people who died, which is, again, we can't compare, but this is something that for Soviet people, it's a big number and it's a big thing to remember. I remember as a child, every 9th of May, I need to call to my grandfather and grandmother and telling them happy day of victory, and kind of like remembering them. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about these two are my great grandparents, Yosef and Valeria. They both been serving in World War II. Both of them today died, but in my house in Israel, and nobody's taking them from me, we have a collection of medallions and certificates in Russia that they got from the war. The one you can see in the left is the medal that they got in Israel 50 years after the war, kind of like remembering them and honoring them for taking part in the war against the Nazis. So that's from my mother's side. And every day of victory, we always like remembering them and what they did for us. She was a doctor, he was engineer, working mostly with tanks. And while they've been in the war, those are my grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather, he's a Holocaust survivor, but he was in one of the ghettos in Leningrad, which is in Ukraine. And he can't hear until today in his right ear because there was a bomb falling down nearby his family and he lost his hearing because of that. And that's kind of like a way of like, he can't forget the war because he literally cannot hear in his right ear. My grandmother, she was like getting birth after the war in 1945 after the victory. And both of them grew up and lived in Kiev. Didn't know each other in the beginning, but they grew up in Kiev, met. Till today, they're not telling me the story of how they met each other. But my grandfather, Edward, he was serving in the Red Army in the 50s. He was an engineer also. And he'll always telling me stories about how he was the only Jew in his battalion, and how he was hiding in the beginning the fact that he's Jewish, until there was coming some soldiers when he was a commander that he found out they've been Jewish, and they kind of had like their own like Jewish like company together. And that's about my mother's side for now. So they grew up in Kiev, and to the Aliyah story to Israel I will get later. Now for my father's side. On the picture to the right, you can see my grandmother. Her name is Zhenya. My father also grew up in Kiev, and she was also part of Kiev. She's not a Holocaust survivor, but her family, and I can talk about her family for hours, but they also been part of the war in both sides, which is a remarkable story that until today we're still trying to solve out. But in 1939, Adi, if you can help me translate the name of Leil Abdollah.
Crystal Knot.
In the Crystal Night. So her father, uncle, died because he was a rabbi walking in the street in that night in Poland. So they also grew up in Kiev, and in the 70s, there was kind of like, actually in the late 60s, there was kind of the beginning for refuseniks, which you mentioned before. The picture on the left is a woman that was one of the refuseniks there was one scenario that they tried to kidnap an airplane to fly to Israel in the end of the 60s. She was one of that group. And because of that, and because it was becoming one of the famous events for refuseniks in that era, the whole world, including the US and in Europe, started to kind of like asking Ussr, what's going on? Why you're not letting the Jewish people to go out? Which was the Cold War era. And because of that, it became the reason for the first immigration from the Soviet Union to Israel. In that 5 years, there was 100,000 people-ish. None of the numbers accurate, but ish 100,000 people who got to Israel. And my father's family was one of them. So they made an aliyah to Beer Sheva in 1971, lived in Beer Sheva for a couple of years. And for a reason I don't know till today, they decided to move to Germany and live in Germany from the 70s to the 90s. And my grandmother still lives there with most of my father's side. We can talk an hour right now only about why does like second generation for Holocaust survivor will move to live in Germany again, but I until today don't understand it either. And that's my father's side. As all of you know, in the 90s, there was the fallout of the Soviet Union from economic reasons. And in that like decade and a half, there was more than 1 million Russian Jews who immigrated to Israel. It's a crazy number. And until today, people don't understand like a country of Israel, which in the 90s was around 4 to 5 million people, in a decade got 1 more million people into the country, which was a lot. And I will get in a couple of minutes to the gains and the events after that. But first I will talk about my mother. So my mother grew up in Kiev. She was studying to be a nurse, and she was actually a nurse in the Red Army when she was 19, 20. And when she made Aliyah to Israel in 1992, she tried to work in Israel in a hospital as a nurse. And you know, when a country getting 1 million more people, there is an overflow of jobs because there is so many people trying to get into a job and not enough places to employ either. So my mother got to one of the hospitals in Tel Aviv, but in the first week, approved her and told her, hey, yeah, join us, be part of the team. But then after a week, they told her, from now on, there is a new law. Israel do not accept license from Soviet Union. So if you want to be a nurse, you need to do the whole exams again in Hebrew/English, which she didn't know at that time because all the exams in Soviet Union was in Russian. And one of the biggest things for Russian immigrants in that decade is a lot of people that's really educated, from nursery to like doctors, engineers, like IT people, and all over the place found themselves without a job because Israel didn't accept the license. So my grandmother, she was a doctor and found herself, as a lot of other Russians, working in jobs that like doesn't require a license, like cleaning places, mostly like working as like waiters, security, and etc. I would take a step back a bit to just like, I think it's one of my mother's favorite stories about her immigration to Israel. So the process of the immigration was when you're getting out of the Soviet Union, in the first step, you're giving the Soviet Union all of your passports, all of your documentary, like all of your like belonging, and you're going to Europe to like a middle country that will get you from their country to Israel. So my mother, when she moved out of the Soviet Union, moved to Belgium for like a couple of days. She was like treating there and like getting all the paperwork that needed. And in that stop, she had 2 options. You're going to Israel or you're going to the US. And my mother in the beginning wanted to go to the US. She said, oh yeah, I want to go to America. It sounds so amazing, so beautiful. I will live the American dream. I will go there. And there was a guy telling her, hey, come on, sign here some papers and you will come after me to the US with no problems. And when she got there, she was on the way to signing. And there was a guy telling her, hey, Marina, do you know what are you signing? She was like, yeah, this is paper to the US. It's all part of like the immigration process. And it was, no, if you will know how to write English and to read English, you will know that you're right now signing up your body to him. So you better know how to sign up there. And my mother was really scared. And she was like, nobody gonna own me. I'm going to Israel. I will be better there. And I'm sure she wasn't the only one experiencing that. And I'm sure you heard some stories in the past. but it's like something from the process of like moving from Soviet Union to Israel and this step on the way. Again, not everybody was like that, but that's something that my mother always loving to embrace and tell. So she got to Israel, she met my father, and somehow from a usual Russian family that you will imagine 1 or 2 kids, we became 5 because my mother wanted a daughter and she didn't want to stop until she had a daughter. And now something I didn't share is why am I Israeli who called Patrik? What is that name coming from? So I'm named after my mother, great mother. Her name was Palina Pasha. She was a Holocaust survivor and she died in 1989. And my mother and her was with a really good connection. So my mother said, the first child I'm gonna give to life will name after her by the first letter P. My mother really wanted a girl and she really wanted to call her Patricia. And when she was pregnant, we were twins in the pregnancy, but unfortunately the twin didn't survive. And I was the only one surviving because, as you say in English, I think it's called, I ate my sister. So I ate my sister by the doctor terminology. And the closest to Patricia is Patrik. So I'm named after my sister and my great-grandmother, which is a Holocaust survivor. And my mother said, I'm not stopping until I have a daughter. So on the picture, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but from the left to right, that's me when I was a kid. That's my other brother. His name is Freddy. And he named after my grandfather. His name was Friedel, and he was a Holocaust survivor. He died in Beer Sheva, by the way. And his name is Freddy because of him. So also named after Holocaust survivor. The 2 kids in the middle, that's the twins that Daddy and Michelle, those are like the youngest and the last one. So Daddy is after David because my mother wanted like a Jewish name after one of the kings. And Michelle, I don't know why my father decided this is the most beautiful name in the world. So this is her name, which is a beautiful name. And to the right and have the most Israeli name is Lior, which translated to my light. And my mother in the middle, Marina. So I grew up in Tel Aviv and I was there. And I grew up until the age of 7, speaking only Russian at home. I didn't know any Hebrew except Russian, which what I only spoke like at home, in class, everywhere. And I found myself when I got to the first grade, Kita Aleph, getting to a school where everybody speaks Hebrew and only like 2 or 3 kids from my class speaking Russian. And that's became a thing because imagine a small kid moving to like I grew up in Israel. I'm the firstborn in Israel, but I was speaking Russian until like the age of 7. Getting to 1st grade when I knew a little bit of Hebrew in a class full of Hebrew speakers, trying to be involved, to be part of it. It sounds fun to like it just like funny. It just sounds funny to other Hebrew speakers to hear the terminology of Russian speaking to several words. So although I have like a funny name also because, you know, SpongeBob SquarePants, which is also like an animated show that was also a thing at that time. So I was like, or like SpongeBob or like Pasha. But one of the most like biggest thing to grow up as a child was the terminology of like, oh, you're Russian. And if somebody didn't like me, they could have always say, oh, you're Russian, go back to Russia. I was 6, 7 years old. I didn't know any history. I didn't know what's all of that. All I knew, I was like, I'm growing up in Israel. I don't know what is Russia. I never been there. But I always got at least once a couple of weeks, stinky Russian, filthy Russian, go back to Russia. That's kids. There is no purpose there, but you know, kids can be mean to each other. And also I got curses about my name. People have been comparing me to a mushroom, which I never understand why. Maybe because like mushroom in Hebrew is pitria, so it's like starting with the same letter. So that's something to grow up with in elementary school, and asking myself always, do I love my name? Sorry. So that's how I grew up. My family decided to travel a lot. So we grew up in Tel Aviv. I moved to Germany for a couple of months to be with my family from my father's side. And in the end, we found ourselves in Beer Sheva. And to grow up in Beer Sheva, it's a different story, because I knew already Hebrew. I had more friends who speak in Russian, and I kind of like, I built my identity. So if you know, when you're senior in high school, there is a tradition in Israel to go to Poland, kind of like March of the Living Week. And that was, for me, one of the most meaningful parts in my life, of going and finally exploring like my Jewish roots, my family roots, my Holocaust roots. My mother's side family, actually my grandfather's side, the one who is not hearing in his right ear, most of them being big rabbis, which apparently I found really weird from a secular family, that our roots are more like or ultra-Orthodox rabbis, small community in Kiev, that most of them died in Babi Yar, which is the killing pits in Kiev. And for me, it was shocking to understand how big of my family died because of the Holocaust. And that's something that really changed my life by the perspective of like my family, my roots, my mission in the world. So in Poland, it was a really emotional experience. And I wanted also to like always like emphasize that for me. And I'm kind of like emotional stuff bringer. So I don't know if you know this term, but like a person who's like finding an item and making something emotional out of it and saving items from like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all to save stuff. So when I was in Poland, in one of the forests that we've been to, we got to see like a killing pit in Poland. And I found that a really emotional moment. So I wanted to keep this memory with me. So I took a leaf with me and I put it back in my suitcase. And I will never forget this story. So I was putting like a lot of like memorable stuff from Poland, putting this leaf from the killing pit, putting in my suitcase, and getting back to Israel. We're getting back to Israel, 5 a.m. All of my kids from school, like 250 kids from school, getting the suitcase. And I was the only one who didn't get the suitcase. Somehow the suitcase disappeared. Somehow the suitcase like vanished. And only like 2 days later, they found it and got it back to my home. And my mother got scared. She was like, my mom, she's like in Russian in general, really superstitious about a lot of stuff. So once the suitcase got back home, my mother took my suitcase, started to flip everything out to understand what's going on there. And she found a leaf. And she was like, what is that? And I was like, Mom, that's like a memory from one of the killing pits in Poland. She was like, what? You brought back this like bad memory, like a bad symbol. That's the reason why your suitcase got out. And she like throw it like as far as she could from her house. That's like just like a funny story from like this experience for me and for my family also. I'm kind of like running about a lot of stuff. So if you have any questions or want to stop me, please stop me and feel free to like, if there's something so far that was like, I don't know, weird or like you didn't understand well. So after understanding my Holocaust, World War II roots, I decided to start to like get to know my father's side family. And that's from 3 years ago. Me and my siblings got to Germany and we met with all of my father family, cousins, not siblings, cousins more, and the bigger family. And we found a lot of in common, and we made in the end kind of like a family tree, which going like 100 years ago from my father's side, and all the connections. And it was like really like big experience to like explore other part of my family. And I know a lot of people saying, oh, Russian family, that's a small family. but is it? Like, you never know like how many our roots getting back and how diverse and like around the world we are. So that's about my childhood a bit. And growing up, it was part of me to always think and ask myself, and that's also about most of the Russian Jewish people who live in Israel, how do I get involved? How do I be in part of the Israeli society? I always was doubting myself, how? So for a lot of us, it was being part of a youth movement. I was growing up in a youth movement pre-army called After Me, which we've been like training before the army and trying to like get ourselves hype out. I did a gap year in this program, and eventually I found myself in the army serving as an infantry soldier in a special forces battalion called Givati, Sayeret Givati in Hebrew. And for me, the army service was the final mark of I'm Israeli. Again, for me, until the army, I didn't felt 100% Israeli, even though I grew up in Israel, even though I did like school and youth movement and everything that Israel is doing. Only the army experience made me, again, that's my personal view, and I will assume from a lot of my Russian friends that that's their experience also. Until the army, that was my biggest mark of like, okay, now I'm Israeli. I don't need to worry anymore about like my Russian connection or Russian roots, and nobody can call me anymore, go back to Russia, because that's not my country. My country is Israel. So that's about growing up. And because I'm the firstborn, my brother also got to the army, Freddy. We served in the same battalion. We actually, I didn't put it in this presentation, but we had like a news, like one of the central news in Israel talking about like the two brothers serving together in the Gaza border, which sounds really cute. But my mother hated it because we missed the Passover dinner because of that. But we found it amusing to like serve together, like make coffee in one of the nights and like, oh, we're siblings and we're serving together, which we never thought can happen. Our third sibling, Lior, also serving right now in the army. He's in Kfir, supposed to end his service in the next couple of months. And that's kind of like most of, I think for me, the connection from the immigration of my grandmother and father to my parents coming to Israel until feeling part of it. But there is always something in our system for like a Ukrainian family that's like parents are like coming from there, of like we always want to remember also what happened before. And I found like the best day in the year to remember and experience and celebrate that, it's Novi God. How many of you know the term of Novi God? Okay, thank you, Adi. So Novi God, it's one of the only celebration, one of the only holidays from Soviet people. As I said before, USSR, Stalin, Lenin decided that no more religious in a country. You cannot practice anything. But somewhere in the late 50s, beginning of the 60s, they started to celebrate the end of the year and the beginning of the new year by the calendar, which is a secular holiday of remembering what we've been part of and remembering what we go to. There is a lot of like small traditions that every family have their own stuff. And no, this is not a Christmas tree, it's a yolka, which might look the same, might smell the same, but it's different by, I don't know, some different roots or something like that. To be honest, I never find the differences between them, but I know that my parents always saying, it's not Christmas, it's yolka, that's the name of the tree. And we're always trying to like make it like an individual, our holiday of like, we're not celebrating any like Christian Jesus stuff. We're celebrating like our family and like surviving the USSR and coming to Israel and making the whole aliyah. And kind of like celebrating our freedom. Because for us, it's more celebration of freedom for our roots and from where we've been to and where we are here. you can find a lot of like Russian parents saying, I'm really happy that my kids growing up not in the Soviet Union, like in our country, in Israel or in the US. I can tell that the same is happening here in the same vibes. So you can see like, sorry.
I just wanted to add something about that. You talked before also about how people treated you when you were as a kid, and in general, how people treated to the Russian who immigrated and the Ukrainian who immigrated to Israel. And a lot of the things is like people don't know or didn't know what are the things that you did that was part of your tradition, because people in Israel, they see that tree and they're like, oh, it's a Christmas tree. These Russians are not real Jews and yada, yada, yada. But it's only because people don't know. It's lack of knowledge that unfortunately we still see sometimes, even though I think now there's more awareness and people more know about the Novi God and what it means. But it is a big part, I think, of this gap that was between like people, the Israelis and the Russian who immigrated to Israel in the late 90s.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. Because awareness is, I think, it's the main purpose here. Nobody knew what the Russians are. Nobody knew the roots. Some people knew, but the awareness was really low. Because when you sing, and you're gonna see it in a video later, but when you sing me as a Russian kid coming to elementary school with a non-kosher pita, which involve like meat and dairy, because as I said, kind of like reflective of like no religious. So our families wasn't keeping kosher because they didn't wanted anybody to suspect that they're Jewish. So my family is a secular. So everybody eating non-kosher because that's kind of like our Jewish tradition. So I was eating non-kosher in school and people didn't understand it. They said, oh, you're not following Jewish laws, so you're not Jewish. Not Jewish, you're Christian, go to Russia. That's like was like the main knowledge for most people, only because like the way you're eating or the way you're dressing. Yeah, Russian been known in the past 20 years to not being dressing kind of like for the Israeli culture. And you know, posting photos of this tree, the main trigger is, oh, you are not Jewish. By the way, in Israel, when you're saying Novi God, a lot of Orthodox Jews will say it's Sylvester. And that's not correct, because although Sylvester, he was a Christian, Adi, how do you say Epiphore?
A pope.
He was a Christian pope in the 7th century, and he died in the 31st of December. So people somehow find a connection that made a lot of people say, oh, that's a Sylvester celebration. There is no connection to the Christian pope from the 7th century until today. But that's like a superstition that's like happening in Israel right now also.
So there was a question in the chat, what date is the Novi God? So I guess it's December 31st, which in Israel, for some reason, we call the New Year's Sylvester. Even though it's not necessarily related, but I don't know why we call it Sylvester, but it is. And as Patrik said, it's one of the reasons, again, that people are thinking these thoughts about the Novi God, it's related to something Christian. But yeah, for the question in the chat, it's December 31st. It's basically a New Year's celebration.
It is, say,
Right.
basically, you can see in Israel that January 1st, no, you will not find, like if you will find, it will be like really rare, but nobody working in January 1st. One of the ideals is the first day of the year will be the way that your whole year will be. So in our family, if you're sleeping in January 1st more than like 7 hours, you're gonna sleep most of the year and you're gonna miss stuff. It's a small, like, I don't know, tradition kind of stuff, but my family, nobody's working January 1st. I'm not working also. It's like a day off of like enjoying the new year and like building for yourself how this year wants to be like. But yeah, if you have any more question about this event, because I know it's one of the biggest like portions in the year that people remember, and there is Russian Jews in Israel. We love to celebrate. We love to like, you know, be up all night. We're meeting the whole family and having like our own L'chaim tradition. By the way, getting back to like not understanding and kind of like misawareness of like the Russian speaking Jewish community, my stepsister, which is not in the picture, it's a long story by itself, but when she was going to Israel, when she was 18 years old, she wanted to join the army. And she got to the army, and you would expect the army is getting everybody in because, you know, Israeli army, they need always soldier. But apparently a lot of Russian immigrants who tried to get to the army got denied because Israel was suspecting most of them will be or from gangs or spies, because Russia was really famous about their spies. So she didn't get accepted to the army, which she's saying until today was like a big influence of like her not. She's living right now in Germany. She's saying that's one of the reasons she was like, oh, you don't want me in your army. Why would I want to stay here as part of like the Jewish state if you're not accepting me? And a lot of them, from the jobs that I talked about, from the army perspective, and in general, the language. People, when they're hearing Russian in the street, not always find it well, especially for elderly and seniors. And that's about it. So Novi God for my family is one of the biggest times of the year. And it's one of the reasons I'm here right now in New York. So after I finished my army service, I joined a summer camp in upstate New York called Tel Yehuda, which is part of Young Judea. And they had a program called Chavura. Chavura was a program that was connecting Russian-speaking Jews in the States and in Israel to have a program together. And I found it really great to find other Russian-speaking Jews that not from Israel. And surprisingly, we had the same childhood story of like the TV show we saw, the superstitions that our parents was part of, same food, and like same type of like behavior also, which was weird in the beginning, but we all find that amusing. And in the picture to the right, you can see our campers who've been also like kids that was like Russian speaking Jews. And we did a big event in camp, which called Novi God in August. So the kids actually created a Novi God in August for the kids, to the other kids in camp, to experience how Novi God is looking like. And the camper who know how to speak and write in Russian made a class, you can see to the right, they taught some of the other campers how to write a name in Russian and how to translate that. And from there, I was like, okay, I think I want to extend my visit and my experience with Russian-speaking Jews around the world. And that's how I found myself here in Kingsby Y in South Brooklyn, which is a big Russian-speaking community. And before I'm going to continue, like we will have like time for questions, I want to show you a video from a TV show called Sorry for the Question, which is a TV show that asking different communities really hard questions that you will not ask in your daily life. So we will see only the first question, and then we'll have time to Q&As, okay? So show screen, show sound. And please let me know if it's too fast or too slow. Good?
למה אתה שומע? יצא לך להכיר מחבל?
מה אתה רואה, חושך? עוד כמה זמן את רוצה לחיות?
אתה יהודי? אתה מדמיין את בת הזוג שלך עם מישהו אחר?
את שומעת קולות?
שלום.
שלום. וואו, שמופכים. מתרגשת?
פה, בצד שמאל יש עוד מכירים, רואים?
כן. זה המים שלי?
שלך לגמרי.
כל המים או צריך להשאיר למרואיין הבא?
בשרפת לידך יש את השאלות שקיבלנו מהמים.
אוקיי. פה יש מלא.
יש תשובות?
תשובות יש גם. יאללה, להתחיל?
מי מקריא? סליחה.
בשביל מה באנו?
את יהודייה? גם ברוסיה היית יהודייה? כן, אני יהודייה, מכל הצדדים והכיוונים.
ההורים שלי חזרו בתשובה. בעצם כשאני נולדתי הם כבר היו דתיים לגמרי, נולדתי לבית יהודי ודתי לגמרי.
אני יהודי, לפי ההלכה, לפי כל הביתים, איך שתקראו לזה.
אני יהודייה. כן, אני יהודייה. ברוסיה לא הייתי יהודייה, כי אבא שלי לא יהודי, אז בזה זה קצת עזר לנו, לא היינו יהודים מסריחים, למרות שלסבתא שלי קוראים שרה סלומון, כאילו שזה יותר, אין יותר יהודי מזה.
אמא שלי יהודייה, אבא שלי לפי ההלכה לא יהודי.
הלכתית אני יהודי, אבל אבא של סבתא שלי הוא ארמני.
אני הייתי יכולה לבחור, האם אני ארמנית או האם אני יהודייה.
וכשסבתא שלי נולדה, החליטו לתת לה שם משפחה ארמני, ולא רצו שתהיה יהודיה. מהסיבות הברורות, אנטישמיות וכו'. וכשאני נולדתי, אז נולדתי כמקסים קירקוזוב, ולא מקס פריידין, כמו שאני היום.
אנחנו לא יודעים מה אנחנו. באמת, אני אומרת, כאילו, אנחנו לא יודעים מה, אני לא יודעת מה אני. אני לא יודעת, אני חושבת שאני, לפי ההיסטוריה שלי, אני לא יהודייה, למרות שעליתי לפי חוק השבות, ואני לוי, אבל טבלו אותי.
לא אכפת לי שאנשים חושבים אולי שאני לא יהודי, אבל מאוד אכפת לי מזה שאני יהודי, כי זה מי שאני.
בשביל יהודי רוסי, 70 שנה, לא נתנו לנשק מזוזות, לעשות ברית מילה ולאכול אוכל כשר. אז היהודים הרוסים פיתחו לעצמם איזושהי יהדות אחרת.
היינו מתאספים כל יום שישי בבית כנסת, היינו חוגגים את כל החגים, אבל בקטע של לחגוג, אני מצטערת להגיד את זה, אבל גם את יום כיפור חגגנו. כאילו, אנחנו לא ידענו בגדול מה אנחנו חוגגים. מה שהיה חשוב לנו זה לאסוף את החבר'ה היהודים, וביום שישי לעשות סוג של קידוש, היינו משתכרים, היינו שרים את התקווה, ואז זה היה הופך לערב מסיבה כזה, כל יום שישי.
במשך הרבה דורות היינו יהודים מסריחים, ז'די, קמצנים, יודעת, כל הדברים האלה.
ברוסיה כן הייתי יהודי, אפילו שהיה לי שם משפחה ארמני. יהודי זה משהו אני לא יודע איך אנשים ידעו, זה משהו שהיה רשום על הפרצוף.
יש לכם מזל שההורים שלכם הביאו אתכם או שילדו אתכם כאן, בגלל זה אתם לא יודעים שיש לכם פנים של יהודי.
ואז אתה מגיע לישראל ואומרים לך, אתה לא יהודי.
שפתאום מלהיות יהודי גאה שם הפכנו לרוסים. אנחנו יהודים, תפסיקו לקרוא לנו רוסים.
אנחנו פה כבר מיליון שנה, אנחנו פה יותר מאשר היינו שם.
נכון שאנחנו גם זרים פה עדיין, יש הרבה נקודות אבל להיות רוסיה פה זה מצחיק, אבל להיות יברייקה ז'ידובקה שם, את לא יודעת אם אתם מכירים את זה, זה מאוד כואב וזה מאוד פוגע. שלום רב.
So I think they couldn't describe it more accurate about the feeling for growing up in Israel, even though most of us been here more than they've been in Soviet Union, and still found ourselves feeling not always welcome and not always fully Israeli as we would expect. I can say that today there is more awareness, but it's still one of the biggest topics for me personally, but I think in the Israeli community, the acceptance of like Russian immigrants still it's a big thing from working perspective, social perspective, but a lot of us, usually my age, getting more and more the feeling of being part of the community. Sadly, our parents been through one of the most tough decades to be part of relocating yourself to a new country, learning new language, and kind of like building a home in a different country. I'm seeing my parents today and I'm looking at them in the most like honoring what they've been through for making me live a good life, which they haven't been experiencing themselves before. I hope I gave you some new insight, and we have a couple of minutes for more questions. If you have, please feel free to ask me any question, even if it's a question that might sound bad. I'm here for everything. And if not, thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope it was renewing some of your visions and perspective of Russian Jews in Israel.
You know, you made a comment about being in the army, and our family went there as a group in 1998 to Israel. And I remember our tour guide telling us that the army is a great equalizer. People come in as Russians, as Ethiopians, as Americans, as Europeans, and they come out of the army as Israelis.
Indeed. And as I said, for me, it's been one of the biggest events to fully get back home and feel I'm part of Israel right now. That's it. I think after my first Novi God in the army, which by the way, I did in the base and not with my family, I felt like, oh, you know what? I'm Israeli, that's it.
Am I muted or can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay, so let me see. Do you speak Hebrew with a Russian accent? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, so I used to speak Russian fluently and my Hebrew was with a Russian accent. Adi can tell that I don't think I have right now any Russian accent, not in Hebrew and not in English, because my Russian today isn't fluently. I can say that my English today is way better than my Russian. I kind of like forget a bit of my Russian language. The only people I'm speaking with Russian and practicing it is with my parents. And because I'm not in Israel, in the past 2 years, I'm talking to them once a day, like FaceTiming, but my Russian language became really like, I can speak still and I can understand. I don't know how to write and read, by the way. And a lot of people from my age don't know how to write and read.
So, do your parents speak Hebrew with any fluency?
So my parents speak in Hebrew, still with accent,
but they're fluent in Hebrew?
Yes.
Okay.
Although my father don't know how to write. He knows, but he's not, he knows how to read, he don't know how to write in Hebrew.
Yeah, about the accent question, I will be honest, I didn't know Patrik is Russian. Okay. Because I was looking for people who helped me with the lectures. And I was like, yeah, I can talk about that. I was like, oh, I didn't even know. Great. So I didn't hear any accent, and I was surprised because they said you grew up talking Russian. So it's like something shifted when you were growing up. So it's interesting.
So just about the Hebrew language or about Israelis in Hebrew, let me see, in America, you can tell if somebody's from the South, somebody's from, different regions of the country by the accents they speak, the accents that they speak the English language. Is that the case in Israel? Are there different Israeli accents depending on where you?
It's more, I think, our grandparents' generation that you can hear what country they came from. If it's like a Russian or more Arabic accent or more, Poland accent, more the Yiddish, but it's not like people in the South talk different from people in the North accent-wise. There are some different words that people will use, but overall, I don't know, like by the way that people talk, you cannot know where they're from in Israel.
Israel is a much smaller country, and although you have many different countries going into Israel, the country itself being so tiny, I don't see how they can get the variation like we get with the South or the Minnesota twang. My Philly nasal thing I got going on here where I talk through my nose because I'm from Philly. You just don't, I don't think you get that in Israel.
Yeah, it's
but
really
I do
more,
agree.
it's really more our grandparents' generation and maybe some our parents' generation, but yeah, that's mostly.
Are you familiar with the very famous, and his name is escaping me, but I see his face in my head, the very famous Russian refusenik who was in prison for so long? come on. He's
Solzhenitsyn.
No. Because he wasn't a refugee. Nick Solzhenitsyn. He wasn't even Jewish.
Natan Sharansky?
Yes. Say
Yeah,
it again.
that's it. Sharansky.
Yeah. So, were you familiar with him growing up, or I mean, he's in government now.
So he always been like one of the biggest symbols for Russian. I can say personally, I didn't know about him until my 10th grade or 11th grade. By the way, he was the head of the Jewish agency for a couple of years. So like I first time saw him in the summer camp experience preparation, because when I did my summer camp in 2018, he was still on the board. So he was like coming and sharing his story. So that's like was the last time I saw him.
You deal with a lot of Russian Jewish immigrants in the United States where you are?
So the neighborhood I'm working in, it's in South Brooklyn, which is Shipshead Bay, Brighton Beach. And when people asking me in Israel where I'm working at, I'm not telling them I'm working in Brooklyn. I'm telling them I'm working in Ashdod, which is in Israel, one of the biggest cities from Russian native people. Because there is, I'm walking in the street, I'm hearing more Russian than English. I'm walking to like my grocery store nearby my house. Like I'm speaking with them only in Russian because like this is the population I'm living in. So for me, I'm feeling kind of like home, to be honest, which is cool. And the teens and kids here mostly Russian speaking, but not all of them.
Really? So why would they be Russian speaking? Are they relatively new, quote unquote, off the boat? Or is it, I mean, don't they speak English mostly?
So in the 70s and in the 90s, there was a big immigration from the Soviet Union in general, and not only Jewish people going to Israel. So there was actually a big wave in the 90s to here also, to New York, to United States. Actually, I'm right now starting to write down an essay about it. I'm in the beginning stages of that because I'm a student for history. So that's one of my finals I need to make. Yeah, but long story short, there was a big immigration in the 90s to here also of Russian speaking Jews.
So you say you're a student, where are you a student?
I'm studying abroad in Haifa. So there is a program that I can study remotely while I'm working here.
Good.
Thank you.
Hey, Patrick, thanks for all that information in the presentation. I was wondering, I had two questions. I was wondering, one, if you think a lot of folks who immigrated from the USSR to Israel, if a lot of people still carry those Slavic traditions in terms of like holidays and different customs, or like I know some people who left Germany in World War II, they're sort of like uncomfortable with German culture. They kind of don't want anything to do with it. So I was interested in that, and then related, I was wondering if you or your family has been back to Ukraine, since it's been a little more peaceful since World War II. Not that it's a great place for Jews nowadays.
Thank you for the question. So I can tell that first, it's a really not personal question for me, but I think every family have their own perspective on that. I don't know if it's half and half, but I know there is some families that have more saving, keeping tradition from the Soviet Union. As you saw, there is like 15 countries. So like Ukraine, Armenian, Turkmenistan, and etc. There are some communities that I don't know how to say their name in English, that keeping more traditions than others. Let's say Bukharim or Kafkazim. Adi, please help me out here because I have no idea how to say it in English.
Bukhar is like my great-grandparents are from Bukhar.
Kafkaz is more like Georgian.
Uzbekistan area.
Yeah, I can show on the map again where is that, but there are some communities that's keeping more tradition. Let's say in Israel, it's known that people from Bukhar and people from Kafkaz, they will still marriage only inside their community. Saving kind of style. I can say that Ukrainian less care about it. We care more about like, you need to remember what happened before. And my parents always saying you need to know how to speak Russian to like, it's all and I found it's really, really important. About the second question, I actually suggested to my family to go to Ukraine to do kind of like a roots trip. I never been there, not in Ukraine, not in Russia, nowhere near there. I've been in Poland, I've been in Germany, but they don't want to go back. My mother said to me, there is nothing to do there. I don't want to see it back. My grandmother, when I got to Poland, she was like asking me, why? You have nothing to do there, stay here. This is like a cursed land. But as I said about the traditions, it's also a personal question to people. There are some families that will say, we don't want to see it again. We don't want to get back. I don't want to hear about this area in the world. I'm in Israel and that's it. And there are some who don't really care about it, that might go, might not go. But from my knowledge, most of the families I know, parents will not want to go back to Ukraine for a trip. It's nothing that like interesting them. They want to forget this time of their life.
Zelensky, the president, is Jewish, secularly so in Ukraine, yeah.
Yeah, he was, actually my mother really loves him because he made a TV show about his becoming president.
Just like Donald Trump, right? I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Again, we're not talking politics, but he made a TV show, and I can say that a lot of Russian-speaking Jews saw this TV show because it was interesting for them to see like, oh, a Jewish president. That's a big thing, even though they don't want to see this country again. But I told my mother that one day I will make them go with me because I'm curious to see how does it look like, and not to like the religious part where everybody going to like the graves and like the ultra Orthodox who going to pray there. I just like want to see like where my parents grew up in. But they don't want. They prefer to go to 100 other countries before they're going to get back to Ukraine.
Oh, Karen, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm interested in your perception of the neighborhood that you're in right now. I know when we grew up there, where Kings Bay was not Russian, but Manhattan Beach was just turning over that way, and Brighton Beach was under the L was really all Russian signs and Russian speaking people. How is it where you are right now?
That's a great question. I have to say, as I said, I'm really enjoying living here. If you remember, like going to Netcost and going to like, it's one of like the biggest grocery stores here. I'm feeling kind of like home. There is still a big community here, but I'm imagining because of like the years that passed through, the population here become more diverse, and there is like less Russian-speaking Jews that's been before. Like I can say that when I was opening one of my programs here, in the beginning, my supervisor told me, oh, you can expect like mostly like Russian-speaking kids. And we found out they haven't been even the most of the kids that showed up to the program. So that's like something about the Russian-speaking Jews. I can say also, and that's actually a good thing to understand about this community. There is a lot of families that love to keep their own circles of friends and their own circles of like, we staying like inside the circle of, this is my Russian speaking Jewish community that I want to be part of. I don't want outsiders. I welcome them if they will be like nice enough for me. But for me as a guest here, it was really hard to get into them and to be part of them and to like to offer them like, hey, I'm also Russian speaking Jews. I'm here like for 2 years. Can I like help whatever programs you do? Because they do really care about education. They do really care about like history. My first experience with them was seeing a Holocaust movie. which like you can find in different like various types of ways. But for me, it was like, yeah, that sounds like right to like show the kids some Holocaust movies to educate them. What else? Like, if you can elaborate more about the question, I think like,
That's fine.
yeah.
Is the Russian community where you are, Russian Jewish community, are they a religious community? Are they secular? Do they have a synagogue specifically for their community? Do they celebrate Jewish holidays?
So I'm not working with synagogues, but I know there are some synagogues here that like populated with Russian speaking Jews people. The community I'm working here is more secular. So one of the Sunday program I'm leading here, which called the Jewish Sunday program, and there I have mostly Russian populated kids. The parents told me that they don't want any religious studies. They want more cultural. They want them to teach Hebrew and to learn about the history. Before me, there was somebody in my job that was more like teaching prayers, teaching like religiously part. And a lot of families here like loved it, but they preferred to focus more on cultural perspective, which I'm trying to bring more because I know these are the needs here. I think like there are some religious, but I'm working in the secular. Holidays, we're doing here community events, which are more like kids coming, and like there is a lot of like activities like inflatable stuff. Last year we did more of in Purim, we did like a carnival, a small one because of COVID. In a normal year, they're closing the whole street and having a huge carnival in the street, which is open to everybody.
For Purim.
Yeah.
So
By the way,
funny. It's religious, but it's not religious for these people, right?
Exactly. It's more like culturally, like it's more culturally celebration. By the way, a block away from here, there is a huge like yeshiva of like religious Jews that work in there. So there is a lot of population. I'm working with the secular because those are the ones that's like coming to my JCC mostly. Jeffrey, you can tell like how it was like years ago. But right now it's more secular than religious.
I will just say there is a question in the chat. Patrick, if you can share again, how did you get your name? Because it's not a very Jewish or Russian name.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So yeah, it's a really good question. I'm getting like a lot. I will love to get a penny for every time people asking why is my name. Especially working here and introducing myself as an Israeli. Oh, Israeli, but Patrick, are you Irish? Are you French? Like what's going on here? Which I always find amusing because I don't know, like maybe I will look a bit French, but I don't know how Irish I am. But again, that's interesting question. So I'm named after my mother, great-mother. Her name was Palina Pasha. She was a Holocaust survivor and she died in 1989. And my mother had a really good relations with her. So she told to herself kind of like, my first child we get name after her for memory, from like respect to her. And in the pregnancy, we've been twins, like a boy and girl. And my mother really wanted a daughter, and she really wanted a daughter named Patricia. So after the pregnancy, my twin died. It didn't survive because, again, maybe I said it wrong in the last time, but I kind of like ate her because that's something that's happening in pregnancy apparently. So because I ate my sister, I'm named after my great-grandmother and my sister. And the closest name to Patricia is Patrick. So that's why I'm called like that.
Feels like a bumper sticker. I ate my sister. Sorry, I have to. Maybe I will make a shirt for you. Karen, you need to unmute yourself. Wait, unmute.
Good that I was on mute, at least you didn't hear me before. So I just wanted to thank you for this lovely talk, and I also wanted to really encourage you while you were there. with all these people with this Russian background, maybe now's the time to learn how to write and read the Russian, because it'd be a skill you'd have for the rest of your life. And, you know, it would just be a great way to keep going with your education and maybe help you along with some of your other history studies. If you could, you know, read and write the Russian, you might get a different perspective by reading and writing things in the original literature.
That's actually a great idea. I always saying to myself, you know, like I'm one of those people who's like always saying to myself, I will learn how to play guitar. I will learn how to do like, and I always wanted to learn how to write down in Russian. I actually tried in the past, but I never like got into it. But because I have the language, it's supposed to be easier. But maybe later on this year, I will find like some good tutor to like sit down with me and like learn everything. But thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here and listening to me.
Toda rabah.
Thank you so much. Toda rabah, Patrik, and toda rabah everyone for joining. The next lecture would be on February 15. We will hear about the Ethiopian Jewish community. I think most of you registered for that as well. It will be the same Zoom link, but I will send a reminder anyway. Patrik, again, toda rabah. It was really, really interesting. And have a good night.
Спасибо.
Спасибо. In Russian,
Спасибо.
спокойной
Я
ночи.
иду домой.